Hello and welcome to another episode of CollectaThought, the show where I collect my thoughts on video games, and today we're going to be talking about Elden Ring, the latest in the From Software line of Souls game, I guess you could say. A series of action RPG games with a big focus on challenging and also more immersive gameplay tropes that we'll go more into later, and also, usually a setting of dark fantasy like the one in Elden Ring. And so, to start this review off, we'll talk about the story, focusing on the Elden Ring as it's called, a very powerful artifact of this world that's been shattered, and well, now your goal is to rebuild it and become the new Elden Lord, basically. Which, is very similar to other Souls games stories of, kind of trying to fix this very broken world or become very powerful in the process. With, of course, some not so obvious choices that might change the ultimate path of the game. And as far as Souls stories goes, this one is fine. I mean, I was interested in it, but it's also like another Souls story. There's only so many times you can pull this very, dark and oppressive world where you have this very hopeless feeling, but you endure anyways. Which, I guess it's their main theme and it's what they do. But let's be honest, this is the 6th game in a series. We've seen this story quite a few times. I still enjoyed it, mind you, but it is not something that's gonna, completely blow your mind, I don't think. What might blow your mind though is pretty much everything else in this game. As we get into the gameplay, obviously the main thing to mention is the open world. But changing Souls games into an open world system is a lot more complicated than it may seem. One of the main things for me immediately that I thought was that Souls games never really hold your hand on where the path of the story is. So when you put that in an open world game, how easily does it become to get absolutely lost in this world and not really know what to do? And to the merit of this game, it is as easy to get lost in this game as it is in any other Souls game, I think. Which by that I mean, it's fairly easy, but you're also always in a moment of the story that you can, look up if you really get lost. That being said, unlike other Souls games, I definitely found that this one was the easiest one to absolutely just get distracted from the main story and go do absolutely anything else. I found myself exploring this game so much that I didn't even know if I was progressing the story or not. Turns out I wasn't, but thankfully also meant that when I did get back on track, I was very overpowered, which is also one of the best things about this game, because Elden Ring is by far one of the hardest Souls games in my opinion, and I think the open world nature of it does lend itself a lot to it, because it is so easy to just find yourself in a location that maybe you're not ready for. But that's not it for why the difficulty of this game is so high. It does feel like the enemies in general are harder. They feel like they move faster, kinda like the bosses and the enemies in Sekiro, but the thing is, Elden Ring still moves a lot more like a Dark Souls game. And in a lot of ways I do believe that the intent of Elden Ring might actually be to kind of find the medium between Sekiro and Dark Souls, where you have this more, RPG focused thing where you can have your character play however you like while not being also very restrictive in its movement. Obviously the main addition here is the jump button, which, it's kind of a joke at this point. But yes, they added a jump button to Dark Souls. Elden Ring. And turns out after Sekiro, platforming came to stay. And I'll be honest, it is a very gamery platforming. How should I explain it? You see platforms in this game and you can platform them, but they don't look like platforms in a video game, right? The ones you expect in something like Super Mario, Ratchet & Clank, that type of game. They're really, built into the world, and as a gamer who has some idea of how video game works, you kind of have to be able to tell what's a ledge that you can jump on and what isn't. It's definitely a game, and other Dark Souls games also have this, where the path forward isn't always very obvious and can often feel like you're kind of cheating or abusing the game in the way that the path you're taking. Very often, jumping between rooftops or jumping between ledges that don't look jumpable are the actual way of progressing the story. It's the type of thing where if you've only played Ubisoft games your whole life, you would think you're breaking the game. Not to, throw shots at Ubisoft games. There's good Ubisoft games, okay? But they also have a lot of those types of games. Regardless, that's one of the things I think Elden Ring does best, while also being one of its weak points. It feels incredibly open, while still having some of those Metroidvania elements to the map that I think makes some of the more linear Souls games very special. But that does come with a caveat, like I mentioned. In an open world like this, to kind of stop you from entering certain areas or move through certain spots, the game has to set up, of course, barriers. That's not anything new. Of course, games have had, either invisible or in-game barriers for a long time. But it does feel like this game resorts to the fear of falling damage a bit too much. I could not tell you how many times I died to fall damage in this game. There is a lot of verticality and there is a lot of trial and error. And for those reasons you do end up just kind of dying a lot, just experiment and trying to figure out how to progress in this game, which I think is a bit annoying, but it's also remedied by the way the checkpoint system now works. Dying in Elden Rings is still very much like any other Souls game. You die, you go back to the checkpoint. Here they're called graces. There's also another type of checkpoint that is sometimes in more linear areas, and they're usually just before a larger enemy or something like that, and they basically work as checkpoints, giving you an option to respawn at that point once you die. Regardless, graces are basically the new bonfires here, and much like any other Souls game, like I said before, once you die, you also drop all your souls and you have to go back to the place where you died to recover them, and if you die again, without recovering them, you lose all of it. So, in that way, it's still very much like the other games. But the thing is, now you also have a fast travel system and you also have a horse. So moving around the world doesn't feel like a terrible game of dying and then taking half an hour to reach wherever you were before. That being said, the game is still very massive and the horse is only so fast. I honestly wish he was kind of a little faster, as sometimes you can die quite away from a grace, but also as you explore more you do find that the way the graces are laid out are in such a way that you're never too far away from one. So usually when you're going really far away from a grace in an open world bit, it's usually because you just kind of missed another one. And so in that way it also rewards exploration, and exploration is definitely the name of the game here. That's how you make the game easier for you while also make it harder, because of course you're going into the open world and just kind of facing the unknown in a lot of ways. This game has listed 81 bosses. I'm not sure how much of those are repeated or just slight variants, but even with that, 81 is a giant amount, and this game feels it. I didn't unlock every area in the map until well after I finished the game. It really feels like there is so much here and I just don't know when it ends. It's legitimately a massive amount of content. You can get just, lost in it and fighting different bosses and getting different armor and weapons, getting items to upgrade that weapons. The usual things that you'd get in a game like this. But there is, of course, that added thing of it being a Dark Souls game and having that feeling to it as well. A big example I'll give here was, during the trailers for Elden Ring, the cinematic ones, how there was this red-headed woman fighting? Well, I didn't see her the whole game. She's part of the story, but she's only mentioned. And so after I finished the game, I was kind of wondering if she had been cut out of the game or something. But no, she is in the game and you can find her, and she has a whole level that would be the size of any of the areas in another Dark Souls game, but it's completely optional and it's like a whole thing that you can do. It's a big part of the game, but also you don't have to, it's optional. And trust me, thank God she's optional because she's one of the hardest bosses. But regardless, that also brings me to another point. A lot of this game is optional. Honestly, I think if you ran through the game, or at least if you could, since I do think that the difficulty would spike a bit too high if you simply followed the story areas, which already is pretty hard to do. You'd have to actively avoid other areas. Since the way the path is laid out is very much not linear, it's more like a big zigzag. And in that way, I actually think that the story does a really good job of kind of enveloping in this world, constantly mentioning pieces of the world to you and you being able to see them on the map and kind of, being able to get close to it, but also knowing that you're not quite ready for them yet. And in that way, it's very immersive, I think. Speaking of the world feeding away information, then we also have the hub world, kind of like in Demon's Souls. We have this hub world where NPCs hang out, and it's kind of a safe area, or is it? No spoilers. Where you can, of course, upgrade your equipment and your weapons, and you can also get blessings. A new thing to this game, you get it by talking to this woman. There's also other ways of getting it through items, but I'm not going to go too deep into that because I don't think, it really matters. It's the kind of thing you want to learn while you play the game. Regardless, there's this lady that gives you blessings by basically hugging her. I think it's very weird, but also kind of nice. I'm not going to go too deep into it. Regardless, this area is also where you get a lot of your information, since of course it's very easy to just get lost. One of the best things Souls games do is, the ability to maintain a story without having checkpoints and waypoints. The game never points you in a direction. You kind of just know it, or you kind of just explore. And by that I mean pointing you in the direction. Obviously the characters give you hints, but they don't just outright tell you things or give you waypoints on the map. And that's kind of one of the main things about this game as well. The map is very clean for the most part. On the map you only really see the areas and the things in them. Like for example, if there's a castle that you found, then it will show up on the map. And also the graces, of course, so you can fast travel. But outside of that, there isn't anything. There isn't a thing telling you that there's an NPC in this area with a quest line. There isn't a thing here saying that you can go there and get a certain item, like every other big AAA game. And that's good, it's such a breath of fresh air. And I think adding to that is the feeling that the game is built around that. I feel like with any other open world game, they do have that option to turn off all of the waypoints, turn off all of the UI, things like that. But then the game isn't really built around it and it just doesn't really work or feel natural. While the Dark Souls game really feel like that. They feel like they do that with a purpose, especially when you notice that the UI itself is actually very crowded. It is an RPG game with a lot of things going on, but its world still feels very alive, and I think that's probably one of the things that makes these Souls games so, beloved and so iconic in its genre. Now, to round off the gameplay, well, I already talked about, you do have more mobility. It's not quite Sekiro, but it's also not quite Dark Souls. Also, I have to mention, it's also not quite Bloodborne. It is beyond that level of movement, which of course makes sense within this open world idea where you do have a lot more paths you can take, while also still having that, Dark Souls character building that feels very in-depth. And it's legitimately an amazing game, and it's hard to add to it without spoiling both story-wise and mechanically, because, I do want people to experience this. So many games today come out completely half-finished, or just have overall disappointing worlds, but Elden Ring feels rich. It is incredibly full to the brim with things to do and to explore. I've put about 40 hours into this game and I still feel like there's more to find. I still have things on the map that I want to go and see that I have not completed. It is legitimately unprecedented how much game there is in this game. Dark Souls is always how I envisioned, fantasy RPGs as a kid, but Elden Ring is how I envisioned video games were gonna be in the future in the way that they felt, and it's very hard to express how impressive it is. This is a AAA game as they should be in our modern time. Now moving on, let's talk about the graphics. And it still very much looks like a Dark Souls game. It still has a lot of its same issues. That's actually something I really wanted to talk about. The game on PC does have some stuttering issues, which I think might stop you from playing, and I would totally understand that. You know, if you have to wait for a patch regardless of how good a game is. The other problem for me was the controller. I could not get a controller to work on this game. I use a PS4 controller usually and I just could not get it to work. So I played the Souls game with keyboard and mouse, which not my preferred choice, but I will also say that mouse and keyboard for Souls games have definitely come a long way. That being said, I do feel still there are a lot of missing features. I would like more things to be mappable. It feels like only certain actions are mappable, not everything, and it can be a bit annoying. I do wish there was more modularity to it, but the default controls are usable for the most part. So, you know, stuttering issues, you kind of have to measure for yourself how much that affects you, and I would just recommend checking what other people's performance is like with the same graphics card as yours, since it does seem to be that some graphics cards definitely have more problems than other and not so much to do with how powerful they are. I'll say that myself with the 3060 Ti, I did find some stuttering, mostly during the open world, especially when it was raining or when I just fast traveled into a new place. But outside of that, it did run fine. And I will say that from memory, I don't remember any stutters during actual boss fights, which I do think is where it matters the most. But once again, if you're sensitive to these things, I would recommend waiting for a patch. Now, less on a more technical side and a more opinionated one, I think this game looks great. I've always loved the aesthetic of the Souls games, even more the Souls games than something like Bloodborne or Sekiro. I just really like that dark fantasy style. It's something I've always really enjoyed, and I think this really felt like the next step over. It looks great. There's very distinct areas from each other that blend into one another in very seamless ways, which I think is impressive. It does, once again, feel like a very cohesive world. The thing that does take me off sometimes though is a bit of the bugs. Obviously, you kind of expect it with this type of game, but you know, a lot of clipping between textures and items is still very prevalent. And it can be annoying because it always happens with your character, right? It's not even so much the rest of the world, it's your main character existing in this world. Things like swords clipping through shields or other items or the character's own clothes. It is something that is distracting and that is constantly on the screen because it's on your character. And I really think it is a bit of a stain in an otherwise amazing looking world. Also, this is a good moment to point out that this game had the help of George R.R. Martin to write the story, which I don't know how much of it he did or how much of it he didn't do, but I will say that in the world itself and the way it exists, if someone told me this was just another Dark Souls game, this was called Dark Souls 4 and it had no involvement from anyone else, I honestly would not have been able to tell apart. Maybe he did the whole thing with the hands. There's a big hand finger fixation with this game. There's finger enemies, there's important figure characters and deities, you could say. And also, of course, it's called Elden Ring, where the rings go. You get the point. I'm just saying that's a theme in the story. I'm not saying he was the one who wrote it. I'm just kind of shooting it out there of, well, we don't really know what he did work on. This could easily have just been something else that Miyazaki himself wrote or someone else on the team. Who knows? Regardless, I really like it, and something else I really like is the music or the soundtrack. It is by far the best soundtrack in a Souls game. It may sound like I'm overhyped or too hyped about this game. My emotions are elevated, and I admit they are. But I have to say also that I was not hyped at all for this game. Usually I'm always very, carefully optimistic about Souls games because while I love the first Dark Souls, I've never been a huge fan of 2 or 3. And Sekiro, while I enjoy it, it is a very big departure from the genre. And you know, at the end of the day, Elden Ring just gave me everything I wanted and more, because I also went in with very low expectations. And so the soundtrack is also an extent of that. It is legitimately great. I don't know if they had better budget or what, but I listened to this and I feel excited, okay? It's an orchestral soundtrack and it really flows from the more ambience, just kind of traversing the world, to just these epic boss fights. It adds so much to the maintaining of the immersion of this world. It's incredible. And I say this as someone who also really likes the soundtrack for other Dark Souls games. I'm not saying that light-handedly, I think. And that goes for the whole game. Elden Ring just delivers on a level that I don't think I ever saw a big AAA game deliver on. I can't think of any game of this level that has lived up to the expectations like this. The only thing that comes to mind is Psychonauts 2, which I enjoy quite a lot, but I still think I enjoy the original better. While Elden Rings, I'm thinking it's as good as my favorite Souls game, Dark Souls, or better maybe. And for those reasons, I am giving Elden Ring the 10 out of 10. My first 10 out of 10, and you'd think I immediately just say must buy. I 100% recommend it, but like I said before, this game does have some issues on PC, and if that is your platform, I would recommend either waiting for a patch or checking to see how the game runs on your specific graphics card, like I said before. But outside of that, yes, of course, it is an absolute must for gamers, Souls fans, people who just want to experience an absolute behemoth of a game. The only people who I'd recommend, of course, are people who, you know, maybe don't like hard games. That's kind of the thing, but I always think that Dark Souls don't really fit into that so tightly. They're hard, but there's ways around it, which is also one of the reasons I enjoy them so much. If you haven't watched any of my other videos, know that a 10 out of 10 is an insanely high score. I don't just give out high scores often, because I do think that, you know, a 6 is a good game, a 7 is a gooder game, an 8 is a great game. So to get to a 10, you really have to kind of be pushing it. This is my first 10, and for reference, before this I had given 4 9s out of my 152 reviews, which, you know, I think says something, I believe. But I'm not trying to convince you of anything. You know, you just kind of have to take my word for it at the end of the day, because that's kind of how reviews work if you haven't played the game as well. Regardless of any of that though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking and commenting, all the things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and RIP Horizon Forbidden West. I'm not playing that game until it comes out on PC, and it's discounted. And if you're wondering why, when I was 19 I made a video comparing Horizon to Far Cry and other Ubisoft games. And I think if you listen to this whole review, you know that I don't particularly have the most fondness for that kind of formula. Anyways, goodbye.